Good afternoon. I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News, coming to you from our digital desk. We want to talk about issue one. Of course, the November ballot is coming up. We've got early voting is going to get underway in the next week or so. And so we want to make sure you have a grasp on what issue one is. It's a little bit convoluted. Unfortunately, it seems like this is now the norm. Whenever there is a statewide ballot issue, there is such a battle over not only getting something on a ballot in front of all Ohio voters, but then a battle on exactly what the verbiage is going to be, so that when you step into a ballot box, when you go to vote early, when you vote absentee at home, and you read that paragraph about what you're voting on, it is not always clear. We're going to bring in Professor Jonathan Enton. He is with Case Western Reserve University in the political science realm. Professor, thanks for joining us again. How are you today?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for having me back.
We seem to have you back whenever it's one of these pivotal, very interesting issues, but very convoluted. Let's get to issue one. This is all about redistricting and the drawing of maps, both for our state legislature and for our U.S. congressional districts. That's why this is so important. Let's start right there. Why is this such a big deal for issue one?
The way the districts are drawn has a big impact on who wins the elections. So if the lines are drawn in a way that favors one party, that party is going to have an advantage. These days, the Republican Party has had an advantage in Ohio. In some past years, Democrats had the advantage. But because of the way the legislative and congressional districts were drawn after the 2010 census, there was an effort to amend the Constitution, a successful amendment effort to amend the Constitution to try to discourage partisan gerrymandering in drawing both legislative and congressional districts. The first time that this new system was used was after the 2020 census, and it didn't go the way the supporters had expected. In fact, the Ohio Supreme Court declared 5 different legislative maps and 2 different congressional maps to be unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders. Some of the folks who saw what happened decided that the problem was that you had elected officials drawing the maps, and because the Republicans had a significant advantage in that process, they decided that, or the folks who were unhappy about this said, well, other states have used independent redistricting commissions. That is, groups that are bipartisan, actually, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and not elected officials to draw the lines. And we've seen that in a number of states. And so some folks in Ohio decided that this might be a better way to go. And so they wound up proposing what is now issue one that will appear on the general election ballot this year.
And what's interesting is, as you said, it was 2015 that we voted on this when we brought in this new commission. And the commission was a 7-member panel of elected officials and bipartisan. It was designed to have both Republicans and Democrats on it. It goes down to who holds the majority as to who gets the most on that panel. But as you said, they were all elected officials. So this new idea that's been brought up by the Citizens Not Politicians group. This is a bipartisan group who went out and got all the signatures, did everything they had to do to get it on the ballot. Their idea is, let's move it away from 7 elected officials and let's move it to 15 citizens of Ohio. They can't be past or former politicians, and they can't be lobbyists, obviously a very important issue. But there is nothing, as you said, we voted on this once and it didn't work. We've had 7 maps deemed unconstitutional by different courts. So
Oh, no, by
what's
the same, but it's actually the same court, Dan.
right? The 2 congressional maps and
Right,
the
right,
five
right.
the 5 state maps. What's to say? Okay, we had 7 who couldn't get this right. Let's make it 15. Why would this time be different? And in your opinion, as a political science professor, would this work?
The reason people think it will be different is because the folks on the commission will not be people with the kind of stake in maximizing their side's take in the process. Now, no system is foolproof, right? But basically what happened in the last go round was, although this was supposed to be bipartisan, in fact, the process didn't work. And I don't mean simply that we got a lot of maps that the Ohio Supreme Court said were unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders. The members of that commission, the ballot board, or the redistricting commission, did not work together. And so the maps were presented on a basically take it or leave it basis by the Republicans. The Democrats opposed them, although the system was set up so that it was supposed to encourage bipartisanship. There are some details in the system that were supposed to encourage that, but it didn't really work. Now, the idea of an independent redistricting commission is you don't have people who are engaged in the political process as currently elected officials or formerly elected officials or as lobbyists. And so the idea is that those folks may be more likely to work together. As I said, do we have a guarantee of that? Of course not. But the supporters of issue 1 say that the odds are better that this system will result in a kind of cooperative process than what we have seen with what was supposed to be a reform the last time around that clearly did not work the way it was supposed to.
And then we have to talk about this, and you use the word cooperation. And of course, you were talking about the current redistricting commission. Now it comes time to put it on a ballot. And here we see again, not a lot of cooperation between Secretary of State Frank LaRose and the group supporting this measure. Citizens, Not Politicians, that's the name of their group. And it comes down to the wording. Frank LaRose gets to set it. It then has to be approved. It even has to go all the way, because of this time, because of the challenges, all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court, because in the very beginning of this ballot issue, and I apologize, I don't have it right in front of me, but the word gerrymandering, which is normally a negative word, especially when we hear political gerrymandering, meaning redrawing the districts so that it favors your political party, whichever side it is. He has found a way, and the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that it can be in the actual ballot issue to, in the wording is basically to make sure gerrymandering is protected by the Constitution. Walk us through why the actual wording on this is going to be difficult for people to understand.
Well, first of all, the actual proposed amendment is quite long and complicated. It has to be because of all the details that they have to address. Now, the language that we will see on the ballot is unusually long. And it's not just that the language uses the word gerrymandering that things were controversial. The way the language that the ballot board approved that we will see on the ballot is essentially an argument against issue 1. At virtually every step of that statement, or every sentence in that statement uses language that has a kind of a negative overtone. It sounds critical. Now, it's true that the language we will see on the ballot does bear some relationship to the wording of the actual constitutional amendment. The majority in the Ohio Supreme Court basically said, well, if you look at the dictionary definition of some of these terms, like, for example, a taxpayer-funded entity that is somehow not accountable to the people because the people can't vote them out of office. At some level, as I said, that draws on language in the amendment. On the other hand, it's not neutral, it's not impartial, it's not really fair in that sense. The court focused, as I said, on dictionary definitions, but dictionary definitions give us what you might call a denotative definition. That is, what does this mean? But words also have connotative definitions. That is, what do they suggest or what do they imply? And many of these words have a kind of negative overtone. Now, people who are opposed to issue one might well make arguments of the sort that you see in the ballot language. But I have said from the first day that I saw the ballot language that was proposed that this cannot be a fair and impartial summary of what's in issue one. There certainly are reasons why people might disagree about whether this is a good idea in general, or whether some of the details maybe could be done a little bit differently. But my sense is that this ballot language is not going to make it any easier for issue one to succeed. Now, I also wonder to what extent people are actually going to stand in the ballot box and actually read the 3 pages. People are likely to go to vote with some kind of a notion of whether they like this idea or they don't like this idea. There's also some good research suggesting that the more complicated a proposal is, the more difficulty the proponents will have in persuading people to vote for it, because some folks will just say, this is too hard, throw up their hands and say, if I can't really figure this out in about 2 sentences, then I don't want to go there. So we'll see. And I think because of the technical complexity of this amendment, I think the proponents were always going to face a bit of a challenge in getting it passed. But the language that the ballot board adopted and that a majority of the Ohio Supreme Court approved in a party line, and these were all party line votes, both at the ballot board and at the Supreme Court, basically makes it that much more difficult to have a thoughtful vote cast if people are going to rely only on the ballot language. So he said, now both the supporters of issue one and the opponents are presumably going out there and they're trying to persuade people through advertising and social media and other ways. But it does strike me that that the language we're going to see, if that's all you rely on, I don't think you're going to get a really complete sense of what's in this proposal, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea.
Yeah, it's definitely tough to decipher. I'm going to try and decipher it for people and break it down in the most rudimentary. And Professor, I'm sure you're just going to say, oh, this is such a terrible thing to do. People should read the entire thing. But If you vote yes on issue 1, you are saying you want this new 15-person panel where they are not politicians, they're not ex-politicians, current politicians, and they're not lobbyists. You want a new 15-person panel to come in, and they will be the ones to draw the lines around neighborhoods and around communities to say, well, this is District 1, this is District 2. If you want to keep it the way it currently is, the 7-member panel that are elected officials who have had 7 maps deemed unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court, then you vote no on issue 1. Is that the basic way to boil this down?
I think that's a pretty good way to boil it down. And folks will have other kinds of questions that get more into the details or into the weeds. But yes, this is essentially a vote on whether you like the way the last round of redistricting went, or whether you think that we could have done a better job. Now, right now, basically, we have 2 choices. We have the current system, and we have what's proposed in issue 1. And some folks will say, well, issue 1 has some details that I don't like, and so that might be a reason to vote no. Other folks might say the way things went on the last round of redistricting was so bad that we can't make the perfect be the enemy of the good. The question is whether issue 1 will improve things over where we are now. And I think that's actually a good way for voters to decide what to do on issue 1.
It is not an easy ballot issue, one that we want people to be educated on. We hope we have done that. Professor, as we get closer to early voting, as we get closer to absentee voting and voting early in person, I'm going to leave you with the final word. Ultimately, is it just important that people get out, they get educated? This is deciding our next president of the United States. What would you like to leave people with?
This is an important election. Whichever presidential candidate you support, whichever U.S. Senate candidate you support, whichever congressional candidates you support, whichever legislative candidates you support. Issue 1 is important because it will have some significant bearing on what our legislative districts and what our congressional districts will look like into the future. And so people ought to keep that one in mind as they vote for the offices. They should also try to get a handle on whether they think that issue 1 or the current system is better from their standpoint and vote accordingly.
And it does seem to go along party lines, that is for sure. Professor Jonathan Enton with Case Western Reserve University, we certainly appreciate the time. Your knowledge is always welcome. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me again. Take care.
Absolutely. Take care. Again, just a chance to get you updated on issue 1. Again, early voting, I believe, starts in the next week to 2 weeks, that you can do that in person, as well as absentee ballots. There are several deadlines coming up. We'll make sure you have a handle on that as well, coming up on our news at 4. Until then, I'm Dan DeRose with 19 News. Have a good afternoon.
19 News is everywhere. Download our CTV apps and